We imagine bare-naked soldiers, enigmatic Druids, and a vanquished warlord kneeling before the Roman eagle when we hear of the Gaulish peoples. From their prehistoric beginnings to their last disastrous conflict with Rome, the ancient Celts had a reputation as proud warriors who were equally capable of gallantry and brutality. The birth and collapse of the thriving Iron Age society, which formerly ruled almost all of continental Europe, will be covered in detail in this special documentary on the Gallic peoples. Since creating these lengthy episodes is really challenging, please think about commenting and sharing to help us out. While a few Greek and Roman writings from the centuries preceding the birth of Christ provide us with a slightly more dynamic window into their society, the ancient Celts left almost no written records of their own existence, so we are largely dependent on etymological and archaeological evidence to piece together their culture. Neither gives us a comprehensive overview of the Celtic world, but they give us a practical collection of facts that we are forced to use in the absence of any other knowledge. The village of Hallstatt, which is tucked away against a lake between the picturesque Alps, is the site of the most widely accepted story of the Celtic origins. An Austrian mine operator named Johann Georg Ramsauer dug the abandoned graveyard of an old salt mining village here between 1846 and 1863. The material culture found here is commonly regarded as the cradle of an early Celtic society and was dubbed the Hallstatt culture after the location where it was found. Based on the development of artifacts discovered at its locations, the Hallstatt civilization has now been divided into 4 chronological stages. Between 1288 and 100 BC, Hallstatt A and B appeared in Central Europe during the Late Bronze Age. The Indo-European Urnfield complex, an ancient material civilization that was prevalent over most of Central Europe, was initially a little departure from it. Mining salt copper and tin and selling them to distant areas was the foundation of Hallstatt civilization. These were essential supplies because copper and tin were needed to make bronze the most valuable metal of the day, and salt was required to preserve meat over the winter. This commerce prospered the peoples of the Hallstatt heartland and continued to be a vital component of their economy for decades to come. Through commerce with the Hittites and Greeks, ironworking was brought to the Hallstatt around 800 BC. As a result, the Proto-Celts emerged as a separate society from the Urnfield complex during the Hallstatt Sea period. They established hill forts all throughout Central Europe and populated them with warriors and craftsmen under the command of small-time chieftains. Around this time, in the early Iron Age, they began to create a more hierarchical class system and social inequality. Excavated graves from the Hallstatt A and B periods were consistently egalitarian and simple, whereas burials from Hallstatt C and later exhibit a significant wealth and status gap. Great barrow mounds, the final resting place of affluent tribal elites, were grouped around their hill forts. Nobles were interred here with their valuables, including axe heads, collars, brooches, and other bronze, iron, and gold metal objects. These jewels frequently had recognizable animalistic and geometric patterns. These barrows' ivory and amber contents imply that they had trading networks that reached as far afield as North Africa and the Baltics. Since many burials contain a particular type of thin cutting blade that is ideally adapted for horse combat equestrianism, was probably a sign of aristocracy and authority during this time. In addition, elaborate horse-drawn colt carts, ceremonial bridles, and tackles were interred with the top tribal nobles. Contact with the Indo-Iranian Cimmerians, who appropriated the horse and wagon as emblems of tribal authority, is probably what gave the horse its significance in aristocratic culture. Perhaps the Hallstatt people's economic and cultural soft power, along with the horse's mobility, allowed them to leave their ancestral homeland and spread their cultural influence over much of Central Europe. Around 600 BC, the civilization moved westward along the Danube-Rhine and Seine rivers toward the Greek colony of Massalia, or present-day Marseille, marking the change from Hallstatt C to D. The early Celts were introduced to the wealth of the Mediterranean realm by the Phocian Greeks of Massalia. They imported a variety of southern goods through them, such as exquisite glassware ceramics and wine, which is the most valuable luxury of them. The Phoenicians and the Etruscans, whose highly developed civilization we have discussed in a previous episode, were among the Mediterranean peoples with whom the late Hallstatt peoples immediately started dealing. The Greek historian Hecataeus of Miletus first mentioned the Celts in May, when he called the people who lived outside of Massalia Keltoi. Was this word Greek for the tall ones, or maybe derived from a tribal endonym, adding to the persistent misconception that the typical Celt was a head taller than their Greco-Roman counterparts? In any case, we still use this phrase today. Due to their grip over foreign income, the late Hallstatt consolidated a significant degree of authority. Fewer but bigger population centers, like the remnants of an extensive tribal complex at Hohenberg in southern Germany, essentially replaced the numerous tiny hill forts that studded the region. At the same time, the barrow mounds were inlaid with opulent items from Etruria and Greece, making them more magnificent than before. The Hallstatt culture peaked in terms of wealth, territory, and power approximately 500 BC. However, how can we be certain that the early stages of a unique Celtic culture are represented by the Hallstatt material complex? Most importantly, the swords discovered in late Hallstatt tombs bore a striking resemblance to the weapons that subsequent generations Greco-Roman authors depicted the Celts employing. Second chieftains were buried in two-wheeled war chariots, a later Celtic funeral custom that was said to have been influenced by the symbolic horse and cart in funerals. Perhaps most significantly, the name Hallstatt itself is derived from an ancient Celtic term meaning salt area, and the geometric Hallstatt period is acknowledged as an early type of Celtic artwork. The fact that the Celtic terms for salt in Welsh, Cornish, and Breton are Halwyn, Halloween, and Holain, all likely cognates of the same old root as the ancient word from which the contemporary town of Hallstatt derives its name, confirm this. All of the evidence points to the Hallstatt heartland as the location of the Celts' first visible appearance, complete with an early Celtic language, tribal structure, and artistic expression. There are issues with this idea, though. Even though cultural artifacts were discovered from Britain to Croatia by the late Hallstatt era, this did not imply that all of the inhabitants of these countries were early Celts. Furthermore, the Hallstatt culture would not have included all early Iron Age Celtic speakers. Around 1500 BC, an older Indo-European tongue gave rise to the early Celtic language that came to be linked with the Hallstatt heartland. Over the course of centuries, this language expanded over most of Central and Western Europe. Due to the Hallstatt aristocrats' cultural and economic influence, people on the outskirts of the early Celtic civilization absorbed the Proto-Celtic language, albeit they did not always embrace the material culture. By the century BC, for instance, the majority of people in Ireland and portions of Spain spoke Celtic. However, the Celtic migrants had mingled with the local inhabitants to create the Celt-Iberian and Gaelic civilizations, which had little to no cultural continuity with the Hallstatt complex. In essence, there were Celtic-speaking peoples who were not part of the Hallstatt culture, and Hallstatt-following peoples who were not, with the Etruscans shifting their trade routes away from the Hallstatt heartland and the increasingly imperialist Massalian Greeks abandoning their old trade connections to try and subjugate the Celts. The prosperous world of the Hallstatt chieftains abruptly came to an end around April. Celtic power thus moved northward and developed into the Tène Hallstatt's powerful successor. The most famous period of ancient Celtic history is the Tène civilization, which began in April. It began in 4 distinct tribal centers, mostly around the Marne and Moselle rivers, and quickly spread over much of Europe. The Tène civilization, which would eventually spread to Britain, Western Spain, and Ireland, dominated Central Europe. France, Luxembourg, Belgium, and Switzerland by 300 BC. The artwork of Tène, which includes cauldrons, drinking cups, swords, shields, armor, and jewelry with intricate spiral designs, is often regarded as being distinctly Celtic. Here we gradually move away from depending mostly on archaeological discoveries and toward the written accounts of classical Greek and Roman writers, who, despite their frequent bias or ignorance, nevertheless provide us with a useful amount of information for assembling the Celtic world, including its language, politics, society, and religion. The world may be familiar to the general population. According to the ancient Germanic tribes, the Celts would have been considered foreigners, as indicated by the term, which is derived from the old Germanic valhas. In contrast, a nascent Roman republic that came into contact with the Latin Celts in northern Italy over the Alps called them Galli, which may have been the name of a single tribe but was used to refer to the entire ethno-cultural group. Although the terms Gaul-Gallic and Celtic will be used interchangeably, the peoples in issue did not commonly refer to themselves in this manner. The idea that there was once a Celtic language is in fact a popular misunderstanding. The more lexically conservative languages spoken by the Gaels of Ireland, and most likely the Celtiberians of Spain, are Celtic, which is spoken throughout north-central continental Europe and contemporary Britain. The contemporary Welsh and Irish languages, which are mutually incomprehensible because they belong to the P and Q subgroups respectively, are still examples of this break. The speakers of their ancient equivalents would probably find it difficult to relate to one another. Apart from the Gaels and Celtiberians, the Britons of the island to their north and the Gauls of the mainland were always split politically. The tribe headed by a military aristocracy and a hereditary chief was the primary social structure in the Celtic world. In a system akin to feudalism, a chief's possessions were further split into administrative regions known as pagi, which were run by smaller households devoted to the chieftaincy. The Helvetii Senones, Venetii, and Tectosagus are among the significant tribes that lived in the late Iron Age, according to Roman records mostly. Some names like the Belgi, who called contemporary Belgium, or the Parisii, who named the city of Paris, are still in use today. Nevertheless, it is probable that the Gaulish peoples recognized aspects of a shared culture that transcended tribe boundaries. The social order was one thing that never changed. At the summit of the pyramid stood the chieftain, who, like his Hallstatt forebears, governed rural populations from a hill fort known to the Romans as Murus Gallicus, which was built with stone walls and wood lattice. There was a warrior aristocracy under the chief. The artisans who resided in and around the chief's hill fort and provided the warriors with weapons and armor came next, and they were mostly expert metallurgists. In a mutualistic relationship, 90% of Gallic society were subsistence farmers who gave their chief a share of their produce in order to preserve his warrior aristocracy, which in turn shielded the farmers from outside threats. The Gallic diet consisted of wheat, barley beans, oats, and peas, and cattle pigs, and sheep were frequently reared for their meat, milk, and wool. The Celts grew olives and grapes in the south of France. Contrary to popular belief, the Gauls were a highly evolved people who could effectively plow even the toughest soils to tools like plows, iron shares, and coulters. The majority of Gauls resided in tiny rural settlements in rectangular homes made of clay wattle daub and wood that were well insulated against the harsh winters. Homes were typically round and constructed on unmortared stone in Britain, Ireland, and northwestern Spain. Although the banquet hall of a military aristocracy might be larger than a peasant's sheep farm, there was little architectural difference between the social groups. The typical Gaul has been glorified in Greek and Roman literature and sculpture as a tall, red-maned noble savage with a manly mustache who is covered in horrifying battle paint from head to toe. In actuality, the typical Gaulish guy would not have been significantly taller than the typical Greek or Roman. The Gauls preferred to dress modestly, however regional variations existed in fashion. Both sexes were frequently draped in cloaks, adorned with vibrant plaid patterns made from natural dyes of copper berries, plants, and stale urine. Women tended to wear long skirts, while males typically wore long-sleeved tunics and loose-fitting pants made from flax and wool. For the Celts, personal grooming was very important. For instance, it was said that both sexes painstakingly and methodically removed every hair from their bodies. Furthermore, the big Gallic mustache stereotype has some validity because it was frequently shown in Celtic and Greco-Roman art, where it was probably interpreted as a symbol of vigor and manhood. It was also claimed that Gallic soldiers bathed their hair with a solution of water and flaked lime, which caused the hair to become rigid and spiked with white. Continental Gauls did not employ tattoos or skin dyes. Instead, they were mostly used by the ancient Britons, who, according to Roman legend, made a bluish dye from the Assatis tinctoria flower known as woad, which, when applied to their flesh, was supposed to offer magical protection during combat. Jewelry was popular among the higher classes and frequently had cultural or spiritual meanings. For millennia, the brooch, a cloak fastener, was a strikingly durable element of Celtic dress. Arm rings and bracelets in the elaborate swirling design typical of La Tène art were often worn. A weight metal neck ring, known as a torque, was considered a sign of rank and prestige, and was believed to grant its wearer divine protection. In light of this, we ought to pause and examine the ancient Celts' religion. Two main myths about ancient Celtic polytheism have been spread by contemporary neo-pagan groups who frequently present the religion as an idealized pure form of early environmentalist nature worship, and by the ancient Romans who attempted to depict the Celts as primitive barbarians. Religion was not consistent throughout the Celtic realm, and the Gaulish gods were not part of a systematic pantheon. More than 400 Gallic deities are known to us now. The majority are either local gods linked with a particular region, such as Sequana, who was worshipped solely near the mouth of the Seine, or the sacred patron of a single tribe. A small number of gods, meanwhile, were well known across the Celtic realm. These would be the deity of youth, Maponos, the sun god Belenus, the horned one, Cananos, the horse goddess Epona, the thunder-wielding Tyrannus, and the warrior tribe guardian Tutathis. One of their most well-liked deities was Luck, who was the patroness of trade, business, and technology. This helped to dispel the myth that Celtic polytheism was just naturalistic. In terms of sacrifice and divination, Celtic religious ceremonies were similarly to the Olympian religion and were rigorously organized. The Druids were a class of professional priests who helped to facilitate it. The Druids are often associated with enigmatic, long-bearded elders dressed in white robes. But in reality, they had enormous political power. They frequently mediated disputes, led their tribe's educational system, and acted as ambassadors and peacemakers on behalf of their chieftains. A dedicant must remember a vast array of oral histories, law, medical knowledge, astronomy, religious ceremonies, and divination techniques throughout the rigorous 20-year training required to become a Druid. Meanwhile, Druidic history unfortunately lacks miraculous medicines that give its drinkers superhuman power. Beyond tribe boundaries, the Druids most likely belonged to a single order. They played a crucial role in preserving a shared identity among the several tribes by hosting an annual pan-Gaulish gathering in the Connites woodlands, a hallowed space where important political or religious disputes were resolved amongst tribes. Officiating offerings to the gods was one of a Druid's primary responsibilities. One of the main components of Celtic ritual is frequently described as human sacrifice. Various types of ritual murder were required by various gods, according to the Roman author Lucan. Tyrannus advocated for males to be decapitated or burned alive in enormous straw effigies, while Teutus's victims were drowned in a vat of water. The Greek historian Diodorus claims that divination also involved the sacrifice of live beings. Since only members of their order were privy to their wisdom, the Druids never recorded anything. The Roman authors who wrote about these traditions had a stake in portraying their Celtic adversaries as wild and barbarian, but we will never have their own descriptions of their religious privileges. Human sacrifice cannot be denied, but we must also consider the narrow viewpoint that contemporary scholars have provided on the topic. Latin Celtic civilization had spread over a startlingly large portion of Europe between the 2nd century BC. Galicia, the country of the Gauls, is a province in both Portugal and Ukraine, two contemporary nations that are very different from one another. This continental distribution was greatly influenced by warfare, which raises the question of what made the Celts such skilled warriors. Greco-Roman authors propagated the stereotype of the Gallic fighter as a barbarian who was fierce in spirit but lacked sophisticated gear and tactics. The whole tale is even more intricate, though. For starters, Gaulish armor and weapons were extremely sophisticated for their day. The ordinary Gaul was lethal in melee and ranged warfare because the Celts were skilled ironworkers who could equip their soldiers with long swords and spears with specific points for thrusting or throwing. The Gallic warriors were protected with a long oak wood shield that had a robust iron boss for blunt force attacks. The majority of fighters wore helmets of the Agan and Port styles, which had a pair of cheek guards that resembled wings and a brimmed iron dome. Additionally, surviving graphic evidence of a sort of metal cuirass composed of closely connected iron rings, the first known example of such technology, provides proof that the Gauls invented chainmail. The legionary's helmet, his loricamata armor, and even his gladius and spatha swords were all modified from Celtic or Celtiberian designs, since the Romans were so enamored with Gallic metallurgy. Therefore, the Celts' inventions are largely responsible for the characteristic shape of Roman armor as we know it today. Body armor, on the other hand, was uncommon among the Celts themselves and was primarily used by a small number of high-ranking aristocrats. Most warriors, on the other hand, entered combat wearing just shirts, pants, or occasionally nothing at all. One of the most persistent myths in Celtic history is the naked warrior. According to historical evidence, a sizable portion of Celts engaged in naked combat either for religious reasons or to instill dread in their adversaries. Despite the fact that most Gauls did not engage in nude fighting representations of bare-skinned Celtic fighters that have survived in art and historical documents indicate that the practice was widely accepted. It's also important to note the deployment of the famous war chariots, which served as both basic transport vehicles and adaptable mobile missile units, swiftly moving soldiers from one fighting zone to another. The Gallic army's main advantage, notwithstanding their arsenal, was their capacity to completely frighten their adversary. The terrifying Celts are described in both Greek and Roman chronicles as roaring and boasting before a battle, conducting ceremonial war dances and letting forth a thunderous roar from their boar-headed war trumpets. You may understand the supernatural fear that a shouting, dancing, horn-blaring, muscular man must have had if you put yourself in the shoes of a superstitious plebeian just off an old olive field or the slums of Rome. The Celts employed very straightforward warfare tactics. Chariot and cavalry riders would flank and disrupt the enemy formation, while expert javelin throwers would soften it. Generally speaking, a Gallic victory depended solely on a poorly planned, blood-soaked charge, the force of which was typically sufficient to crush the opponent formation and make it simple to kill them one by one. Despite lacking the discipline of a legion or phalanx, ancient Celtic combat was neither crude nor simple. War was a way of life for the Gauls, and their army's ability to instill dread in their adversaries and courage in one another allowed them to conquer not just most of continental Europe, but even the doorstep of a fledgling Roman Republic. Many daring Celtic battle chiefs took their retinues southward to Italy, which the Celts knew to be a fertile country of olives, figs, and wine, as Gallic northern and central Europe grew overpopulated starting about April. A multi-tribal group of immigrants, led by the King Beloveses of the Betterigus, crossed the Alps and waged war on the northern cities of the Etruscans, a politically autonomous but culturally advanced network of city-states with its heartland in present-day Tuscany, according to Livy, marking their arrival on the peninsula as early as 600 BC. The Gauls established the colony of Mediolanum, the present-day city of Milan, after expelling the Etruscans from the Po Valley. Subsequent migratory waves ensued, and by April, a number of Gallic tribes had taken control of a portion of northern Italy that extended from the Adriatic coast to the Alps. Eventually, their Celtic neighbors absorbed the indigenous Ligures to the west and Veneti to the east. Although the Gauls were becoming more powerful, they were not the only rising force in Italy. Rome was a little city-state of around 25,000 people in 400 BC, living in modest brick and timber dwellings. It would take a long time for Rome to develop into the timeless marble metropolis that it is today. However, throughout the last century, the Romans had seized control of every city in the Latin League, deposed their king, and become a vibrant republic. Marcus Furius Camillus, a skilled Roman commander, set Rome on a collision path with the Celts in 396 BC when he overran the Etruscan city of Veii, gaining a foundation for future northward expansion. Regarding the origins of the first Gallo-Roman conflict, contemporary historians disagree. Dionysius Thersites, the tyrant of the Greek city of Syracuse, is said to have sent a Gallic tribe to invade Rome in order to punish the Romans for aiding his opponents in Messina. Others assert that the warlike Celts invaded Rome just for glory and loot without any motivation. The seeds of strife were planted when the Etruscan Clusium Lucumo's ruler had an affair with a married lady, according to Dionysius of Halicarnassus. In an attempt to utilize the Gauls of the Po Valley as a tool of retaliation, her resentful husband, a powerful trader named Aranus, traveled north and persuaded them to invade Clusium. King Brennus of the Senones, who was eager to wage war against Clusium because he desired its wealth and lush fields, answered Aaron's summons. The Gallic horde frightened the citizens of Clusium, who appealed to the Romans for assistance. The Roman Senate responded by sending 3 ambassadors to act as impartial arbiters. Brennus curtly said, "For the same reason Rome conquers her neighbors," in response to the diplomat's question about why he had declared war on Clusium. Soon after, tensions increased, and the Clusians and Senones delegates engaged in an armed altercation. One of the Roman emissaries killed a Senone warrior in the heat of the moment. Furious at the diplomatic lapse, Brennus dispatched envoys to Rome to seek the extradition of all 3 diplomats, but his requests were turned down. In order to settle the score, the Gauls launched a blood feud against the Romans and moved southward. In a flash, the Roman military tribunes raised an army and marched to confront their enemy. Rome was years away from having a professional legion in the century BC. While the masses battled with a variety of destandardized weapons and no protection, wealthier residents equipped themselves in the Greek hoplite tradition. On the Elia River, they took a stand. The testimonies of 2 Roman authors, Livy and Diodorus Siculus, are crucial to our understanding of the Battle of the Allia in contemporary history, due to their inherent biases and, more significantly, the fact that they lived more than 3 centuries after the events in question. Neither of these can be taken at face value. Instead, they chronicled a story that had already been passed down for countless generations by the time they wrote it. However, for the sake of simplicity and linearity, our understanding of this conflict will mostly rely on Livy's evidence. And it's a damning testament, as Livy says virtually nothing positive about his Roman forebears. The consular tribunes in charge of the Roman army acted egregiously negligently after deciding where they would face their barbarian foe. They neglected to construct defensive ramparts, establish a suitable camp, or carry out the necessary sacrificial rites to their gods to guarantee that divine fortune was on their side. Furthermore, Livy critiques the Roman combat configuration, which was a single line probably formed by individuals who were wealthy enough to have armed themselves with a complete hoplites panoply. The right was held in reserve on a neighboring hill, as the tribunes spread their wings. In an attempt to avoid being outflanked, this was done, but it simply made the center weaker because it was now too dispersed to create a strong defensive lockstep. The consul's decision to place their troops across the Allia River perpendicular to its distributary, the powerful Tiber, was arguably the most grievous error they committed. The Romans had effectively pushed themselves against a wall and restricted their own mobility in doing so. Brennus's Gallic army, which probably outnumbered the Romans by a large margin, peeked over the horizon on July 18th. The pale, long-haired giants who now stood across the field from the Romans possessed a terrifying aura that no opponent, whether Etruscan Sabine or fellow Latin, had yet to match. According to Livy, the Gauls' grotesque cries and discordant clamor filled the Roman line with terrible noise, and fear spread like a disease. Brennus rapidly assessed the Roman right flank as the most dangerous part of his opponent's battle line, because if he assaulted the Roman center directly, the reserves atop the hill might circle down and attack him from behind. Brennus confronted this danger head-on in true Gaulish way, directing his most ferocious warriors to storm the hill and drive the Roman right out of its post. So roaring, screaming, and blasting their carnixies, the Gauls started their thundering charge. They threw a blistering barrage of javelins at their enemies as the Celtic warriors drew in, reducing their target to the point that the legionaries nearly broke when they surged up the bluff and crashed into the reserve line. Morale on the Roman left and in the middle fell when they saw their compatriots on the right falter. Seemingly, before the Gauls had even attacked them, they were paralyzed with fear and started routing. They ran with their backs to their enemy and ended up against the banks of the Tiber. As they blocked up the riverside in their frantic, frightened retreat, thousands of Romans tried to cross the river. Many drowned, burdened down by their armor, and many more were killed by the pursuing balls. The majority of the Roman army, however, had fled to the opposite side of the rapids, where they sought refuge behind the walls of Veii, a city that Rome had captured just 10 years before, once the chaos and carnage had calmed. The effectiveness of Gaulish scare tactics against an unprepared adversary was demonstrated during the Battle of the Allia. As the Gallic horde's heedless violence turned them into something like primitive bogeymen, the wolves prowling at civilization's door, a terror of Celts would be burned into the Roman national consciousness for generations to come. King Brennus led the Senones to Rome, following his resounding victory. It would be 800 years before another foreign army ever sacked Eternal City. Later, Roman historians claim that although the rest of the city was completely pillaged, a core of senators and physically fit citizens managed to escape to the fortress on the Capitoline Hill to launch a resistance. Twice, the Senones attempted to capture the Capitoline, once in a midnight invasion that was famously thwarted by the honking of Juno's holy geese, and once in a frontal attack that was rebuffed. Both armies were debilitated by malnutrition and pestilence after months of stalemate. When the Romans lost their resolve, they decided to force the Senones to leave by offering them 1,000 talents in gold. According to Roman historian Livy, the Gauls manipulated the weighing scales in order to defraud the Romans of more tribute than was previously agreed upon. Brennus shouted, "We victus!" as he tossed his own sword onto the scale in response to the Romans' protests. To the defeated woe. At this very moment, Marcus Furius Camillus arrived with a relief army, according to Diodorus of Sicily. As he said, "Non oro sed ferro recuperandes patria." he boldly tossed his own sword upon the scales. He then criticized the Gauls, saying that their denials of the Senones battle were probably the product of Roman propaganda. We defend Rome not with gold, but with iron. Centuries after the sack occurred, Livy and Diodorus wrote their narratives, most likely in an attempt to salvage some honor from a very terrible period in Roman history. Specifically, Camillus's heroics at the final minute were probably a whole fiction. The actual account of what happened is likely to be as simple as this. The Gauls defeated the Romans, blockaded the Capitoline Hill, received payment, and then left. Given that the Gauls were a basic war group that most likely only wanted to collect loot and return to their homes, this oversimplified interpretation is tenable. While Gallic influence in Italy continued to grow, it would take a generation for Rome to recover from the destruction caused by the Senones. Gaulish mercenary companies formed a mainstay of numerous anti-Roman factions, including the Greek tyrants of Sicily and a certain up-and-coming Carthaginian thalassocracy. While Celtic war parties often pillaged the Roman hinterlands during the early centuries BC, the Gauls would wage war against other classical civilizations than Rome. Now, let's turn our attention to the east, to the land of the hoplites and philosophers, and discuss the Celtic invasions of ancient Greece. Early in the century, BC Gallic war bands had made their way into the northern Balkan Peninsula, where they would engage in intermittent combat with the Paeonians, Thracians, Illyrians, and other indigenous groups over the following century. The Greek historian Strabo claims that in 335 BC, a certain Alexander Yesus, that Alexander was camped along the Danube River after winning a campaign to defeat the Illyrian tribes. He was greeted there by a delegation of tall, strong Gauls who were foreign barbarians who had come to befriend the Macedonian monarch because they admired his ability to lead troops. According to legend, Alexander asked the Gauls what they dreaded most, thinking that they would be so amazed by him that they would respond, "Alexander." Rather, the arrogant Gauls said that their main worry was that the sky would collapse on their heads. However, the Macedonian king's courage in not invading Greece throughout his reign was much admired by the Celts, who were always willing to pay respect for a deserving warrior. Alexander would go on to conquer the majority of the world before dying young in Babylon. As his former lands were split up by internal strife among his former generals, the wealthy country of Hellas came under the attack of Gallic warriors seeking simple loot. A war party, commanded by the Gallic chieftain Cymbeles in 298 BC, pillaged its way across Thrace and Macedon before being halted on the slopes of Mount Haemus by the Diadochi, King Cassander's army. However, the Gallic Surti gained territory in Thrace during this expedition, establishing the town of Serdica on the location of present-day Sofia. When a horde of 85,000 warriors, primarily from the Volca and Boii tribes, divided into three contingents and attacked Paeonia, the remainder of Thrace and Macedon, at the same time, in February the next Celtic wave would come. The army of Ptolemy Keranos, the son of the founder of the Ptolemaic dynasty in Egypt, and the present king of Macedon, was defeated by a war commander named Bulgios during this voyage. Gallic troops threw the Macedonian monarch from his war elephant and cut him to pieces in the ensuing fight. The desire for more invasions into Greece was heightened by these early victories, and a year later, a leader by the name of Brennus started urging another trip south. Legend has it that Brennus summoned a meeting of Gallic chieftains and introduced them to a group of physically frail Greek prisoners. In order to demonstrate that the Greeks were a weaker people than the Gauls and could be easily overrun, he contrasted them with his best and most physically fit men. Brennus was able to bring together a sizable tribal alliance by 279 BC. According to ancient accounts, his army had an astounding 150,000 soldiers, while more recent estimates place the number closer to 50,000. Unabated Brennus ravaged northern Greece, which was undefended. According to other accounts, Brennus made the sardonic comment that the gods should be giving to humans because they are wealthy when asked about the sacrificial nature of pillaging the temples. The narrative of the Gallic invasion of Greece has survived mostly due to the works of Greco-Roman authors, as is customary. In this instance, the Greek geographer Pausanias lived in a Roman-ruled Anatolia in the year AD. Pausanias lived over 4 centuries after the events he was recounting. As with Livy and his account of the sack of Rome, he is prone to a number of prejudices and anachronisms, particularly when depicting the Celtic invaders who were portrayed as violent and barbaric. However, our account of Brennus's campaign will be anchored to Pausanias's account of events in order to preserve a simple narrative. Since there was no army big enough to stop them, Brennus's horde appears to have encountered little to no opposition as they tore through the Thessaly area. In fact, it seems probable that some Thessalians even enlisted in the Gallic horde, either voluntarily or under duress, with the hopes of becoming wealthy via plunder and looting at the cost of their fellow Greeks by joining the Gauls. The Hellenic kingdoms of Macedonia and the Near East, as well as the city-states of southern Hellas, were always at odds with one another, demonstrating how endemically divided the Greek people were. Brennus was probably well aware of this and believed that any united defensive force big enough to challenge him would not be able to materialize due to uncontrollable Greek infighting. This presumption would turn out to be incorrect. The Greek city, states around the Malian Gulf, started to feel the heat as a great band of barbarian raiders burned the land of Macedonia and Thessalian. Thus, a defensive coalition was created in an unusual act of collaboration, which was probably accomplished by the Athenian statesman Demochares. 3,000 weakly armed footmen and 500 cavalry from Phocis, 700 footmen from Locris, 400 hoplites from Megara, 7,000 hoplites, and 800 light footmen from Italia, and 10,000 fully armored heavy hoplites, and 500 cavalry from Boeotia made up this coalition, according to Pausanias. Athens sent a sizable squadron of trireme vessels to the war effort, but their share of the land force's 1,000 hoplites and 500 cavalry was comparatively little. The Greek allies took up position as the Gauls began to march south after depriving Thessaly of its wealth. They decided to halt the Gallic advance at the narrow pass of Thermopylae. If you've heard this one before, stop us. Before long, the Allies had set up camp in the pass, where more than 200 years before, King Leonidas had made his last stand against the Persians. More than 200 years ago, the Greeks and Persians were there. In an effort to stall the Gallic approach, the Greeks there sent their cavalry and 1,000 light soldiers to burn all bridges across the Spercheios River after learning that Brennus' force was already in the Vothiotis area. This would not work because Brennus was, as Pausanias reluctantly stated, neither completely incompetent nor inexperienced for a barbarian in the art of strategy. In retaliation, the war leader selected the strongest swimmers from his army and sent them to areas of the Spachaios that resembled shallow and vast marshes. Here, the chieftain's carefully chosen Gauls crossed the river by paddleboarding over it, while amusingly employing their big oak wood shields as pool floaties. This water crossing would have been difficult for a Greek hoplite in full metal panoply, but it was easy for the lightly armored Celts. Instead of fighting the Greek advance army, withdrew back to Thermopylae after learning that a group of Gauls had crossed the river. Brennus then picked up the Malian Gulf's locals and had them make bridges over the Spegios so the remainder of his army could cross. Fearful of Brennus and keen to drive him and his destructive barbarians from their lands so they could loot elsewhere, the Marlians jumped at the chance to take on this duty. The Gauls crossed the Spercheios and then moved into the hinterlands outside of Trachis, where they pillaged the city of Heraclea. They didn't remain there for long either, as Brennus now focused all of his energy on chasing the army away that resisted him. The Greeks saw a swarm of muscular men with mustaches and spiky hair rise over the horizon as the sun rose over the Thermopylae Pass one fateful day. The fight was begun when the Hellenes gathered their highly armored hoplites, forming a compact phalanx as they blocked the path and awaited the impending attack. The foundational element of Celtic warfare, a thunderous, blood-curdling charge, opens Pausanias' description of the first Gallic invasion. Tens of thousands of Gauls charged the Greek line with wild abandon, throwing javelins into the phalanx before colliding with their enemy in a tidal wave of bare-chested rage. However, they were up against disciplined professional men, rather than the chaotic chaos of a young Roman republic. The Greek phalanx remained strong, their spears bristling and their shields clasped against the attack. The battle was vicious, with the Gauls fighting like crazies to breach the wall of hoplite shields. As long as there was still life, they continued to be passionate despite being pierced by arrows or javelins. Some pulled the spears that had struck them from their wounds and utilized them in close combat, or flung them at the Greeks. However, the massively armored Greeks could easily defeat their poorly armored opponents, regardless of how fiercely they chopped away at it. Despite having cavalry, neither side was able to employ it, since flanking maneuvers were difficult due to the congestion. While the Athenian navy brought their ships as close to the shore as possible, and from the decks of their triremes raked the Gauls with arrows and every other type of missile, the Hellenic light infantry further reduced the numbers of the Gallic hordes by throwing javelins, slinging rocks, and firing arrows at them from behind the front lines. The pass of Thermopylae had turned into a battlefield for the Gauls, just as it had been for the Persians 3 centuries before. Following a day of combat, Brennus was forced to order the withdrawal after realizing that the Greek allies would not be forced from their position. Many of the Gauls were crushed under their allies' boots, and many more fell into the marsh and vanished under the muck, demonstrating how chaotic this withdrawal was. With thousands of Gauls dead and few Hellenic fatalities, the Battle of Thermopylae was ultimately a resounding success for the Greeks. Though Brennus had lost a large portion of his fighting force and his troops were completely disheartened, he was not prepared to pack up and return home. Thus, this victory had not permanently eliminated the Gallic menace. Brennus came up with a scheme to disband the Greek alliance because he realized that he would not be able to defeat his opponent as long as they were unified and positioned at a choke point. Under the leadership of 2 chieftains, Orestius and Combutes, he sent a sizable force of footmen and cavalry to the neighboring country of Aetolia and set it on fire and sword. Pausanias vividly depicts this scene. The fate of the Callians at the hands of Combutes and Orostorius is the most wicked ever heard of, and is without a parallel in the crimes of men. They accomplished this by crossing the bridges on the Spurhius, then cutting through Thessaly and landing on the Aetolian city of Callium, subjecting it to a vicious sack. Every man was put to death, and some elderly men were slaughtered in the same way as infants at their mothers' breasts. The Gauls murdered the plumper of these sucking babies, drinking their blood and consuming their flesh. The intended goal of this violence was accomplished, as it forced the Aetolian troops at Thermopylae to abandon camp and quickly defend their houses. However, it also roused a hornet's nest which would swarm down on the Gauls. The remainder of Aetolius's cities, horrified and incensed by Callium's fate, started to organize spontaneous militias. Women joined their men in picking up arms in a righteous wrath to fight off the invaders. The Aetolians turned to skirmishing tactics after realizing that the Gallic sword was only effective at close quarters. They assaulted the Gallic column at a location known as Corchalia, showering the Gauls with arrows, slings, and javelins. The Gauls were shredded since they lacked armor and were only shielded by their national shields. The remainder of Orostorius and Combutes' raiding group hobbled back to Brennus at Thermopylae after more than half of them were killed. Brennus had attempted to flank the Greek blockade in the meantime, scaring some villagers into disclosing a route through Mount Oeta that would enable him to elude the Greeks at Thermopylae and launch an ambush from behind. When Ephialtes of Trachis betrayed King Leonidas 300 years ago, he really showed the Persians the same route. Brennus led about half of his army across the mountain route, leaving the other half under the leadership of a soldier named Achichorios, whom he ordered to launch an attack as soon as the surrounding maneuver was finished. This time, the Greeks had left this hidden hill path, protected by the Phocian hoplites, having learnt from the Persian defeat of their forefathers. Despite their valiant efforts to block Brennus's route, the Phocians were ultimately overpowered and forced to flee, but not before they were able to dispatch runners to the Greek army to alert them to the situation. The Greeks knew they were about to be pincered, so they retreated, boarded the Athenian warships, and set sail for safety before the mission could be encircled and saved. At this point, the unified Greek force reorganized and took a last stand. With more than 16,000 troops lost in the conflict and subsequent withdrawal, the Gauls were routed. The Greeks viewed it as a triumph brought about by Apollo himself, who felt compelled to chastise the barbarians who were defiling the shrine. Brennus committed himself after being thoroughly humiliated, and the majority of the remaining Celts withdrew back to Thrace. A contingent of the Gallic horde, primarily made up of warriors from the Tectisagis Trochmii and Talistobokii tribes, had split off from the main invasion force and crossed the Dardanelles into Anatolia prior to the march on Delphi. This was the only noteworthy outcome of the unsuccessful Gallic invasion of Greece. This troop had arrived in Greece to settle in contrast to Brennus's main force, which had come to raid and pillage. They gained permanency in the area by acting as mercenary shock troops in the numerous conflicts between different Hellenic monarchs and erected forts on the rocky highlands of central Anatolia. These Gauls dwelt in an area of Asia Minor that came to be known as Galatia, and the inhabitants were called Galatians. Interestingly, there is evidence that the Galatians of Anatolia maintained their Celtic language and culture until the century AD, despite being surrounded by foreigners and cut off from the rest of the Gallic world. The Celtic world reached its zenith around 279 BC. Dispersed throughout a vast area that crossed the borders of contemporary countries as varied as Turkey, Italy, France, Britain, Portugal, Spain, Ukraine, Czechia, Austria, Switzerland, and Bulgaria. The Celts were living in their heyday, but like other heydays, it was short-lived. Something significant had been demonstrated by Brennus in Greece. A professional army with proper training and equipment fighting as a unified, disciplined unit was more than capable of withstanding the roaring horror of the Gallic rabble. A specific Latin republic back in Italy was recovering and prepared to exact revenge on the barbarians who had degraded her, so much so the Gauls would soon learn a valuable lesson from this harsh reality. The Roman Republic had enlarged its territory and established itself as the dominant force in central Italy, following its victory in the Second Samnite War. The Etruscans, Samnites, and Galixinanus tribe all attempted to stifle Rome's expanding influence in February when the Third Samnite War broke out. Livy claimed that the heads of the legionaries were mounted on the Gallic spears as they sang their triumphant war songs during the Senones massacre of a Roman army outside the Etruscan city of Clusium in February. The Senones had been the Republic's nemesis since they had sacked Rome 2 generations prior. Later that year, however, things took a different turn when the Senones and their Samnite allies engaged the Romans outside of Centium, where they were routed. Leveraging their triumph in the Third Samnite War, the Romans advanced northward and by February had taken over the Senones territory, establishing a military settlement known as Seneclica. They had finally exacted revenge for the sack of Rome. The Gallic idea of invincibility had started to fade, making this a pivotal point in the Gallo-Roman narrative. But what had changed since the fall of Rome that made it possible for the Republic's troops to ultimately face up against the most fearsome warriors in antiquity? The Romans discovered that the phalanx they had acquired from the Etruscans and Greeks was not a flexible battle formation, particularly on uneven terrain, or against a particularly pliable adversary after being humiliated by their Italic relatives at the start of the Second Samnite War in March. They developed the novel manipula system with the intention of creating a more dynamic standing army. The typical Roman legions were arranged in 3 rows under this arrangement, with each row consisting of a basic unit of troops with 120 heads called titular maniples arranged in a checkerboard pattern. Because they were distinct units, the dynamic maniples were able to move around more efficiently than a phalanx, which was made up of single, conjoined rows of warriors. The 3 typical rows of manipular legions were composed of hastati, or new recruits on the front lines, principes, or battle-hardened troops behind them, and triarii, or the most experienced elites, in the last line of defense. The manipular method, first designed to combat the Samnites on horseback, quickly demonstrated its efficacy against the Celts. As you will remember, the main strategy of Gallic warfare was to use terror to lower opponent morale before launching a single fierce assault to breach their defenses. The new maniples were far better prepared to withstand the Gallic attack, although this had worked in March. Because of their 3-line reserve structure, even if the Hastati front line failed, there would be new seasoned principes and triarii to take their place, preventing a single charge from overwhelming a Roman legion. Furthermore, the manipular legion's overall agility enabled them to offset the potency of more mobile Gallic troops, like as the war chariot. However, it should be mentioned that the Romans were still susceptible to Gallic warfare, despite these advancements. Many tribes adopted fighting strategies better adapted to fending off the professional Roman war machine, as the centuries-long invasion of the Celtic world went on, winning numerous battles that postponed the imperial march into Gaulish territory. Rome would get embroiled in a number of military conflicts in the decades after their acquisition of the Senonese land, first with Pyrrhus and his Stoic war elephants, and then temporarily with Carthage. The path into the Celtic territories of the Po Valley was now open, and by the end of these battles, Rome had established itself as the undeniable ruler of Peninsula Italy. The tribune Gaius Flaminius, who would later lose his life in combat against Hannibal at Lake Trasimene, introduced a measure in February that would divide up territory in the old Senone territories in Persinium among the Roman colonists. This act served as the main catalyst for the next great Celtic War. Although many sections of the populace strongly supported this plan, many others vehemently opposed it out of concern for the barbarians' response. They had good reason to be concerned, because many Celtic tribes saw this obvious repopulation of areas that had only recently belonged to their own ancestors, and became convinced that Rome was now fighting them, not just for supremacy and sovereignty, but also for their total annihilation or expulsion. Two of the biggest Italian Celtic tribes, the Insubres and the Boii, formed a solid alliance and dispatched delegates into Gaul because they were unwilling to enter that good night softly. They finally came to the lands of the Gassati, a fierce, profit-driven clan of Celts from the Rhone Valley, who often sold their murderous skills as mercenaries to the highest bidder. The local twin kings, Concoletinus and Anaroestus, gave the Italo-Celtic diplomats an audience when they arrived in the Gassati kingdoms. They talked of Italy's immense richness and how much money could be brought back if the Romans were overthrown and the peninsula fell into their hands. After being convinced of the viability of this mercenary argument, the Gassati started assembling an incredibly large and well-equipped army from both their own territory and Celtic tribes throughout Western Europe. At the same time, the Carthaginian Empire advanced toward the Second Punic War by capturing the majority of Hispania. This was made possible in large part by the large number of Celtiberians who joined the two kings' fast-expanding invading force. In order to focus all of its efforts on the upcoming Celtic invasion, Rome suddenly threatened, on both sides, renewed its prior pact with the Barchids of Spain. When the plunder-hungry horde, headed by the Gassati, crossed the Alps and joined their compatriots in Italy in December, the storm finally arrived. In response, Rome sent a military force of 40,000 soldiers, led by Consul Lucius Aemilius Pappus, to Ariminum to wait for the Celtic assault. Messengers were dispatched from Rome in all directions in a rush of activity. In remembrance of the Republic's consul of Ero 225, Gaius Attilius Regulus, who had been putting down an uprising in Sardinia at the time one traveled there. Other hurried messengers arrived to the courts of rival tribes of the Cassati, such as the Veneti and Cenomani, who, after being offered the Republic, turned against their Gallic brethren and threatened to conquer their territories. In order to protect against a potential Veneti invasion, the invading coalition was compelled to divide its forces, leaving a portion in the Po Valley. Rome's diplomatic lethality was one of its most effective weapons, even in these early times. Etruria was attacked as a whole by the Gassati, Insabres, Boii, and other tribes who overran the country's meager defense force and pillaged its hard-earned riches. Rome itself was the target of the barbarian horde's march, which met with little resistance and must have conjured up the worst fears of every Republican citizen. But when the Celts arrived at Clusium, only 3 days away from the Holy City, they were told that a Roman army of Sabines and Etruscans, numbering 40,000, was pursuing them. At dark, the twin kings turned to face the threat and approached their adversary closely before setting up camp for the night. The uncivilized barbarians now employed a cunning ploy. The Celtic cavalry were told to stay in camp until dawn, allowed them to be seen after they had set all their fires. But the foot soldiers retreated to a neighboring village named Facile, where they set up a field of traps along the route they anticipated Rome's armies would take and hid in ambush. Since modern Faesal Viasile and modern Clusium, Siusi, are more than 120 kilometers apart, it is impossible for them to have retreated in such a short period of time. As a result, some contemporary authors propose that there was another lesser-known facile that was closer to Clusium. In the morning, the unidentified praetor noticed an exposed and seemingly vulnerable formation of enemy men on horseback. He started after the Celtic horsemen, who galloped off in the direction of Faesulae upon his approach, thinking he would win easily. Sadly for him, the Roman legions were caught off guard as they passed the booby-trapped location and were routed with 6,000 dead during a bloody battle. The Celts encircled and trapped the remaining Roman soldiers as they fled to safety on a nearby fortified hill. However, the victorious attackers left a cavalry force to guard the hill before retiring for the night, since they were tired from the previous exertion and wanted to relax. The outnumbered Romans would be assaulted if they did not surrender by dawn. However, Lucius Aemilius, who was stationed at Ariminum and had learned of the invasion of Etruria, sent his consular force to the region during the dark hours. The consul promptly received messengers from the desperate Roman army remnant, alerting him of the situation after setting up his own camp within viewing range of both the Celts and the latter. As a result, at dawn, Aemilius personally led his horse towards the Roman-held hill, while his military tribunes organized his soldiers in battle shape. King Aneroestus immediately advocated retreating home after recognizing that the two enemy troops nearly equaled their own strength in order to avoid risking all of the looted goods. The Celtic army started to retreat north along Italy's western coast, agreeing with their commander. As they did, Aemilius united the Fagal catastrophe survivors in his own army and started to follow the barbarians. He refused to engage in a direct fight, preferring to harass the enemy rear continuously and capture lone forage groups when the chance presented itself. Aemilius's consular colleague Regulus traveled by sea from Sardinia to Italy, arriving in the city of Pisa as the Gausates resumed their slow retreat north. He was unaware that he was now right in the line of the roving attackers. Regulus and his 40,000 men were marching quickly toward Rome when they came across and routed a small, well-prepared group of foragers close to Cape Telamon. They also captured a few of them. When these barbarian prisoners were questioned, they disclosed all that had happened. In the present circumstances, the main Celtic army was close by and moving quickly toward them, with Aemilius gnawing at their heels. After being taken aback by the enemy's close proximity, Regulus was ecstatic with the strategic position. with his colleague to the enemy's immediate south, and himself barring the way of retreat, there was a genuine chance for complete triumph. Following the conclusion of the questioning, which most likely resulted in the deaths of several Celts, Regulus organized his citizen legion's infantry into a conventional combat formation, with grizzled Triarii veterans and reserve-seasoned Principes in the line, Hastati young bloods in the line, and Velite skirmishes up front. Regulus personally led the mounted equites to occupy a strategically placed hill just off the Telemann road, as the legionaries began to march down it in a characteristically disciplined Roman fashion. He hurried the effort because he was eager to secure the position before the Gassati and their allies arrived. The approaching Celts were not aware of Regulus's army in front of them because of the fog of battle, and they thought the horsemen were actually Aemilius' forces that had slipped around during the night when they saw the cavalry capturing the hill in front of them. The two Celtic kings ordered their own cavalry and some light infantry to secure the landmark in order to retake the hill from this seemingly isolated group. However, they encountered far greater resistance than they had anticipated, but they gradually made progress. When a Roman soldier was apprehended and brought to the Cassate leadership, shortly after it became evident that Regulus's consular army was nearby. The Celtic leadership immediately realized that they were going to be crushed by two Roman armies, one on each side, and that they were positioned for combat in an unusual two-line formation. Teresci and Boii battalions faced north, while the formidable Insuperes and ferocious, totally nude Gassate warriors faced south in one line. On either wing were chariots and wagons. As soon as Aemilius saw this strange deployment, he knew his consular brother must have been in the area and went to help him. In order to accomplish this, he raised his own legions to engage the Celtic infantry, and the remaining cavalry arose to support his comrade on the hill, escalating the conflict there. Consul Regulus, who was last seen fighting valiantly and courageously, was killed in the tumult, as the Romans gradually started to turn the tables on their Celtic opponents in the battle for the hill. His skull was severed and presented to the two kings as a symbolic reward, but it was insufficient, since the Roman equites, who had been reinforced, quickly routed the Celtic cavalry, took control of the hill, and achieved a strategic victory in the process. The legionary vice then slowly started to close as Roman troops in checkerboard formation moved in from both sides of the Celts' two-faced battle array. In an attempt to frighten the Republic's soldiers, a flurry of horrific war cries, deep trumpets, and hornblowers created a great deal of noise as they approached, but they continued to advance. The besieged Celts were hit by a terrific rain of light javelins as the velites of both Roman armies came within missile range. The naked south-facing Gassati began to suffer greatly right away, but the north-facing front rank, made up of Teresci, who were clad in light armor, a cloak, and a shield, managed to withstand the steel storm. Due to the Celtic shield's inability to completely enclose a warrior's body, several Velitses' missiles were able to pass through the gaps and hit vulnerable areas like the legs, resulting in severe injuries. A javelin had a better chance of hitting a Gassate warrior from a distance if they were bigger and more physically intimidating. The distance and the unrelenting shower of iron from the sky made it impossible to countercharge, so some of the nude fighters lunged at the enemy ranks. Most of them were quickly destroyed by ranged weapons, but some made it to the Roman light forces before collapsing. The damaged Gassati retired behind their relatively well-armored Insubre colleagues, having been scythed apart before the genuine legions had even been engaged. Both groups of Roman Hastati moved forward at this point, each brandishing their deadly pilum javelins before brandishing a terrifying thrusting sword. At first, the fight was an event challenge, pitting Celtic valor, physical strength, and fighting skills against the infamously lash-laden discipline of Rome's world-conquering legions. The Astarte retired and let the more seasoned Principes take the lead as they were unable to stop the Insubres Boii and Tarici from bravely defending both their homes and their profits. The resilient Celtic line was progressively reduced to dust by this hit, yet they remained intact. According to Polybius, despite being nearly slashed to pieces, they defended their position with valor, on par with their opponents, and they were only inferior as a force and as individuals in their weapons. Aemilius's triumphant cavalry surged down the hill and fell headfirst into the worn-out Celtic line, crowning Telemon's victory despite their heroic defense. Although there was no dispute, the cavalry had no such qualms, but the foot-based barbarian warriors preferred to die where they were rather than go away. In what was likely one of the biggest battles ever fought on Italian territory, 40,000 Celts were slaughtered at Telamon. 10,000 more vanquished barbarians, including their ruler, Conquest, who was left alive in anticipation of a victory, were taken into Roman custody. The consul marched north and raided Boii territories in the Po Valley as a prize for his legionaries, giving the men complete freedom to plunder, pilfer, and destroy. After completing that, he triumphantly returned to Rome, where Conquest was the main display. The loss at Telamon demonstrates yet another drawback that hindered the disunity. Celtic leaders consistently put their own tribe's demands first, and even when they did collaborate, it was just a short-term solution. The Boii tribe was forced to retain a sizable percentage of its men north to protect their boundaries rather than bringing the entire might of their army down against Rome, because the Romans had already paid off the opposing Cenomani and Veneti tribes to invade Boii territories. The difference between the Roman and Gallic fighters' equipment quality was also significantly influenced by Celtic discord. The Celts were very talented metallurgists, as we discussed in the last chapter, but they were unable to combine their resources to arm everyone fairly because of their divided tribal organization. Rome, on the other hand, had a single, unified government with sophisticated infrastructure and a centralized government that could produce professional legions with uniforms. The Romans conquered much of northern Italy after pushing far into the Celtic Alps, following their victory at Telamon. The Republic in Carthage, commanded by Hannibal Barca, this time would engage in a second round of combat a few years later, so they wouldn't be able to enjoy the pleasure of victory for very long. Hannibal planned to march via the perilous Alps in an attempt to surprise the Romans, one of the most famous military strategies in history. There, the Boii and Insubres greeted him as a liberator and gathered in large numbers to join the Carthaginian army. Hannibal's army had to battle several tribes, such as the Cenomani, who had pledged allegiance to Rome. However, Gallic mercenaries and Celtiberians, whom we shall discuss later, made up a large portion of the Carthaginian army in the Battle of Cannae, when 30,000 Romans were massacred. Let's go ahead a bit, because we all know how Hannibal's narrative ends. Rome turned its focus back north, as the Boii and Insubres resisted Roman expansion after emerging from the Second Punic War, triumphant but bruised. They even turned against their old allies, the Cenomani, who had gained nothing from their association with Rome. However, by January, Rome had put an end to these uprisings and had ultimately subjugated all of northern Italy's Gauls. Let's now travel west and investigate a lesser-known theater, where the Celtic warhead and the Roman eagle battled. The Iberian Peninsula has been a very cosmopolitan region from the beginning of written history. Numerous Celts and non-Celtic peoples, including the Lusitanians, Teutoni, Aquitani, and Iberians, were there by the century BC. Their languages and cultures most likely existed before the Celts arrived in the area. The distinct Celtic culture of the Celt Iberians, who resided in northwestern Spain, was most likely the result of mingling Celtic migrants with indigenous Iberians. In contrast to the Gaulish languages of the rest of continental Europe, they spoke a Celtic language. There were, however, a number of Celtic-speaking groups in Iberia whose material culture was more consistent with the dominant Latin complex seen in the rest of Europe. Rome and Carthage's ongoing conflict is central to the tale of the Celts in Iberia, just as it is in Italy. For decades, the North African Empire maintained colonies on the south coast of the peninsula. But in the period between the First and Second Punic Wars, Hamilcar Barca and his son Hannibal advanced well interior. Despite their ferocious resistance, Celtiberian tribes, such as the Carpetani, were eventually defeated. As a result, Iberia would emerge as one of the Second Punic War's most important theaters. Carthage was supplanted by Rome as the new foreign ruler of southern and eastern Iberia, which they split into two regions: Hispania, Caetaria, nearer Spain, and Hispania, ulterior, further Spain. Following their bloody but successful apocalyptic battle against Hannibal Barca, soon after the peninsula's proud indigenous populations started rebelling against the Roman eagle. It is worth noting that similar to all the other Celtic wars we have discussed so far, the narrative of the Republic's conquest of Iberia is derived almost entirely from Roman sources, namely the Alexandrian historian Appian and the previously mentioned Livy. Therefore, the following account is presented with the standard caveats that must be included when attempting to put together ancient history using culturally biased authors who lived many generations after the events they describe. The Teutoni, a non-Celtic indigenous group residing in the present-day Andalusia area, were one of the native peoples in Hispania to rebel against Rome. To increase their numbers, the Teutoni employed more than 10,000 Celtiberian salespeople who resided close to their territories. In fact, the Celtiberians had gained notoriety during the Punic Wars for their mercenary labor. The Iberians of the East Coast soon joined the massive uprisings that quickly swept over Ulterior and Hispania Caetaria like wildfire. The Caetaria Gaius Sempronius Tuditanus was killed in combat, and several wins were gained against the nearby Roman garrisons. The iron-fisted consul Marcus Porcius Cato was sent by the Senate to put an end to the feuding locals when word of the intensity of these disturbances reached Rome. In January, Cato landed in the Gulf of Roses with a force that included 2 Roman legions, 15,000 Latin allies, 800 cavalry, and 20 vessels. The consul made fast inroads into the native Iberians' territory. He established a base of operations in the Greek city of Emporion and employed a cunning combination of psychological warfare and diplomacy to smash overtly rebellious tribes like the Indigetes while gaining the allegiance and obedience of other Iberian tribes like the Iligetes. Cato restored Roman rule over Spain's east coast in a matter of months before moving south to conquer the Teutoni. He apparently promised the Teutoni's Celtiberian mercenaries a hefty bribe to get them to resign, which they did. The territories of the Teutoni were now completely cut off. The Celt Iberians would pay a price for their rash choice to steal Roman riches. Cato turned against the Teutoni and Iberians after suppressing their uprisings. He successfully besieged and took control of the fortified hill town of Sagontia, the center power of the Celtiberian Aravaci tribe, by marching his force northward. The other tribes in the region were forced to demolish the walls of their hill forts and surrender to Roman rule when Cato advanced along the Ebro River, which is the center of Celtiberian territory. During his stay in Hispania, Marcus Porcius Cato claimed to have destroyed over 300 native communities and more cities than he had spent days there. He brutally put an end to the wave of anti-Roman uprisings across the peninsula. It guaranteed the long-term existence of the fledgling republic in the area. However, it was by no means a lasting solution to the widespread opposition to Roman rule. After Cato was summoned back to Rome in January, Publius Cornelius Scipio, his political opponent, assumed the role of praetor of Hispania Ulterior. Scipio continued Cato's work by confronting and conquering the quasi-Celtic Lusitani tribes at the Hispanic Ulterior frontier near Alipa, which is close to present-day Seville. The praetor of Hispania Caeteria, Marcus Fulvius Nobilio, had begun a campaign more into Celtiberian territory, encroaching on the territory of the Carpetani, a tribe that had previously fought the Barcids of Carthage with great vigor. Rex reacted to this onslaught. Hilerno carried the battle to the Romans by uniting the tribes of the Carpetani, Vitonis Vicae, and Celtiberi in an anti-Roman alliance. Nevertheless, Nobilior routed his men outside the stronghold town of Teletum, and he was taken prisoner alive. The majority of Celtiberian tribes formally surrendered to Rome after this, but there were always occasional uprisings and opportunistic raids. There would be another full-scale struggle in 181 BC, when a Roman proposal to send thousands of Italian settlers to Hispania sparked a great rebellion among the Celtiberians. Historians now refer to this as the First Celtiberian War, one of 3 such clashes. Despite not mentioning which particular tribes took up arms, or even the names of their leaders, Livy gives very little information about the coalition that formed to oppose the Republic. However, he makes it clear that they mustered up to 35,000 men, the greatest force the Celtiberians had ever raised to fight Rome. Quintus Fulvius Flaccus, the acting praetor of Hispania Caeteria at the time, had only about 10 soldiers at his disposal. Cavalry, 6,000 Latin auxiliaries, and 3,000 Roman legionaries. He obtained an extra 6,000 native auxiliary by levying troops from the nearby tribes that were sympathetic to Rome. Nevertheless, his army was less than half that of the opposition Celtiberian alliance. However, Flaccus relentlessly pushed the initiative, capturing the Carpetani's land and easily taking over the town of Ibera, while concentrating the bulk of his force just beyond its boundaries. The Celtiberian host established a strong camp on a hill 2 miles from the town and emerged on the horizon a few days later. Flaccus gave his cavalry orders to scout the opposing stockade's size and defenses, but to flee if the enemy cavalry assaulted them. For a few days, nothing happened, and this was completed without any problems. The Celtiberians then moved out of their camp and established a battle line challenging the Romans to engage in combat after a protracted standoff. Flaccus told his soldiers to stay in their camp. The Spaniards continually swarmed out of their camp throughout the course of the following 4 days, but the Romans never retaliated. The indigenous people eventually stopped attempting to provoke their enemy into conflict. Without ever interfering with one another, both sides fell into a submissive pattern in which they routinely sent out their cavalry to scout the other. Flaccus lulled the Celtiberians into complacency by turtling up in his camp, giving them the impression that action was unlikely to occur very soon. He sprang his trap as soon as he was certain he had accomplished this. As darkness fell, he gave his subordinate, Lucius Achilleus, the command to gather 6,000 native auxiliaries and a force of cavalry to round the mountain behind the enemy camp and assault it from behind. Then, like a snake in the grass, they waited. Achilleus instructed a troop of his cavalry to ride out in front of the opposing camp and challenge them to a combat in order to set off the trap. The Celtiberians sprung into action as soon as they spotted these riders in front of them. They sent out cavalry to pursue them, and then infantry formed a battle line and joined in the chase, drawing the majority of the Celtiberian troops as far away from their camp as possible. Achilleus gave the order for his soldiers to flee. Flaccus gave the command for the majority of his army to attack when the Spaniards were half a mile from their camp. The army advanced on the enemy in 3 distinct corps. Only 5,000 warriors remained on watch as Achilles' army on the hill rushed down into the Celtiberian stockade. They were totally unprepared for the ambush, and the Roman equestrians took the camp with minimal opposition before setting it on fire. The Celtiberians were filled with fear and dismay when they witnessed their stockade on fire. Their confidence dissolved as they realized they were now essentially stranded and had nowhere to go. But they decided to fight until the finish, as Livy acknowledges. The Celtiberians engaged in combat with such ferocity that it appeared they would temporarily breach Flaccus's defenses as they recklessly smashed into the Roman lines. Achilles' detachment and the troops garrisoning Abura, however, soon joined the Romans and crashed into the Spaniards from the back and the flank, respectively. The fight turned into a massacre now that they were encircled. According to Livy, Roman, deaths were at least moderate, while over 20,000 Celtiberian insurgents perished, even though the Romans killed the Celtiberian uprising with their triumph at Abura. It took 2 more years to put an end to it completely. Flaccus's soldiers were attacked in the Manlian Pass in January 1980, and while they managed to repel their attackers, they suffered significant losses in the process. Sempronius Gracchus succeeded Flaccus as governor of Hispania Caeteria in 179 BC. After that, Gracchus reportedly demolished more than 300 local castles during the year he was in office, as he plowed into the Vaci and Celtiberi's territories. By directing the establishment of Roman cities on tribal lands and enticing Celtiberian warriors to join the Roman army, Gracchus implemented an aggressive Romanization campaign in the Ebro River Valley. Additionally, he took members of their nobles as prisoners and forced the majority of the indigenous tribes to sign treaties that prohibited them from constructing new fortified villages. Gracchus believed that by taking these steps, he had stopped rebellions from occurring in the future. He was mistaken. In Hispania, ulterior, the Lusitanians and Vetones declared war on the Romans in January of 1955. The Celtiberian Belli tribe may have taken advantage of this diversion by ceasing to honor Rome and boldly constructing a 7-kilometer wall circle around their fortress of Segeda, all the while persuading nearby tribes like the Titi to settle in the region. Their goal was to make Segeda the center of Celtiberian opposition to Roman control. The Republican Senate was well aware of this, but when they objected to the fact that the people of Segeda were breaking a treaty they had signed with Sempronius Gracchus 20 years prior, The Celtiberians inside sarcastically retorted that the treaty had limited them to fortifying already existing towns rather than constructing new ones. The Second Celtiberian War started because the Romans, of course, could not stand such impudence. Quintus Fabius Nobilior was the consul the Senate appointed to quell the most recent uprising in Spain. He landed in Hispania in the early spring with a force of 30,000 soldiers. Nobilior discovered Segeda deserted as the locals had realized they wouldn't complete the wall construction before the Romans came. They had fled to Numantia in the north. In addition to being the seat of the Arawaki tribe, this sizable walled city was the political, military, and economic center of Celtiberian independence in central Spain. The Arawaki and their friends formed an alliance with the Sigidans there, and they chose Carus as their war leader to guide them into combat. Nobilior demolished Sigida with characteristic Roman brutal precision, and then moved north to Numantia. Carus' army, which included of 500 cavalry and 20,000 Celtiberian footmen, attacked the consul as he was leading his army through a dense woodland. The army rushed out from the tree line and crashed into the Roman column with a vengeance. The precise location of this woodland was not mentioned by Appian, who documented this incident. No matter where it was, it would always remain a legionary cemetery, because Carus won a great battle there with his soldiers, destroying more than 6,000 Roman people. According to Appian, the Celtiberians pursued in disarray once the Romans started routing, led by the courageous Carus, who displayed heroic prowess in battle. Carus was slain here when the Roman cavalry, which had been defending the baggage train at the back of the column, regrouped and rushed upon him. With their commander gone, the other Celtiberians retreated. Even though they were severely wounded, Nobileo's troops will live to fight another day. Nevertheless, because they had been humiliated by Carus's Celtiberians on the day of the festival of their deity Vulcan, the Romans would not fight on that day for years to come. Two new chieftains, Ambo and Luco, were chosen by the coalition of tribes to lead the anti-Roman military effort when their general died. On the way to Numantia, however, Rome's ally in North Africa sent Nobiliores legions with 10 war elephants and 300 Numidian light cavalry. An indigenous army had set up battle lines in front of the walls and was preparing to meet the Romans in a close-quarters conflict when they reached the rebel stronghold. With the war elephants in the back, Nobilior split his army in two and moved forward. The consul didn't order the Roman wings to split apart until the two forces were ready to combat, at which point the large-trunked monsters were revealed. The inhabitants ran back into their castle after being thunderstruck by the sight of such beasts for the first time. A bloody conflict broke out after Nobilio gave the command to attack the fortifications. Appian depicts a pretty disorderly set of events in the subsequent pandemonium. After being hit in the head by a huge falling stone, one of the elephants turned ferocious, attacking his comrades and destroying everything that stood in his path without distinguishing between friends and foes. Excited by his yells, the other elephants started to follow suit, dispersing and flinging the Romans in all directions while crushing them underfoot, and the Romans fled in chaos. About 4,000 soldiers and 3 elephants were killed when the Numantines swarmed out and followed them after spotting this. Many weapons and flags were also taken by them. Ultimately, Numantia had resisted the Roman assault, and Nobilio had been thrown on his own pachydermic petard. Appian mysteriously explains that Nobilior's effort to attack the town of Vaccinium, which he withdrew in shame, accomplished nothing. Furthermore, when he was retreating from that location, the Celtiberians attacked him once more, and killed Biasius, his cavalry master. Since the Republic's supplies were kept at Oculus, this slew of Roman catastrophes forced the town to turn to the rebels, dealing another serious damage to the war effort. The Roman expedition was completely crippled and had no choice but to withdraw to their winter camp in desperation, where the extreme cold and lack of food caused many of the troops to perish. No one was surprised when Nubilior was fired the next year, since his attempt to defeat the Celtiberians had been a total failure. Marcus Claudius Marcellus took his seat as consul in January. Marcellus outperformed his predecessor right away after arriving in Iberia with 8,000 troops and 500 cavalry. He cleverly avoided ambushes, and instead of attacking Numantia's formidable fortifications directly, he crushed the people's will to resist by destroying their comparatively weaker countryside. Eventually, it became clear that in spite of their bravery and spirit of battle, the Celtiberians lacked the resources and personnel necessary to oppose the Roman war machine, which would continue to send army after army into their territory until they were reduced to dust. In order to find peace, the Aravacae, Belli, and Titi tribes came to Marcellus. The representatives of those tribes were dispatched by Marcellus to Rome, where they had diplomatic discussions with the Republican Senate, with the tribes reiterating their commitment to the treaties their ancestors had signed with Sempronius Gracchus a generation before. The eventual consequence was a restoration to the status quo antebellum, thus placing them under indirect Roman overlordship once more. If it weren't for the heinous cruelty of his successors, Lucius Lucilius Lucullus and Servius Sulpicius Galba, the praetors of Cytherea and Ulterior respectively, Marcellus's diplomatic skills may have brought about enduring peace. In 1951, Lucullus launched a murderous campaign in the territory of the Vici tribe, a monstrous undertaking that even Roman author Appian denounces as the foolishness of a man driven solely by fame and wealth. After promising the Lusitanians peace and leniency if they laid down their weapons and submitted to Rome, the governor of Cytherea teamed up with his counterpart in Ulterior to end the Lusitanian War, which had been going on since January. However, after they did so, they carried out a treacherous massacre. A Lusitani called Viriathos, one of the survivors of this atrocity, used his anger toward the Republic to launch another huge uprising that would destabilize the Iberian Peninsula for another 2 decades. Soon, the Celtiberians had gathered their falcata swords, joined the Lusitani, and decided to try one final time to escape the Roman tyranny. Because the fortress of Numantia was once again the center of the indigenous war effort. The outcome was the Third Celtiberian War, sometimes referred to as the Numantian War, and ironically, where the permanent end of Celtiberian independence would occur. After a protracted siege, the mighty fortified city succumbed in 133 under the control of the Roman politician Scipio Aemilianus, who starved its defenders to death. The majority of Hispania was then ruled by the Romans. Rebellion and revolt, however, continued to be widespread throughout the area. Only after the Cantabrian Wars in 19 BC, which concluded an incredible 2 centuries of conflict, did the entire peninsula fall under the control of the empire. Ironically, the Iberians' bravery was demonstrated by the fact that one of the regions outside of Italy that the Romans battled the longest to fully settle was also one of the ones they conquered. Our tale now moves eastward to the central Anatolian highlands, which are scorched by the sun. The Galatians were a group of Celtic tribes that had been brought to the area as a result of King Brennus's unsuccessful invasion of Greece in 279 BC. The Galatians had embraced many aspects of ancient Greek culture and lived among a sea of Greek-speaking successor nations to Alexander's Macedonian Empire. Since their Gallic savagery made them the perfect shock troopers in any ambitious Macedonian king's army, they mostly earned their fortunes as professional mercenaries. The Gauls of Anatolia made a fortune for a century by stealing the wealth of Greek kings on behalf of other Greek kings. The Galatian tribes joined the army of Antiochus III, the most powerful ruler of the Seleucid Empire and the Hellenic world around the turn of the century. The Gauls must have thought that this would be just another deal. They were mistaken. Antiochus was actually fighting the Roman Republic for control of the Greek-speaking world. The Seleucid king's hopes would undoubtedly be dashed when the Romans and their Pergamene allies soundly beat his cataphracts, war elephants, scythed chariots, and Gallic mercenaries in the Battle of Magnesia in January. The Roman consul, Gnaeus Manlius Vulfso, suggested that the Republic should extend into the highlands of Galatia after the Scipio brothers humbled the Seleucids. In reality, Rome was most likely lusting for the enormous loot that the Anatolian Gauls had amassed throughout their century of mercenary labor. But the official excuse for war was that the Galatians had fought alongside the Seleucids. Consul Gnaeus Manlius Vulfso started assembling his army in Ephesus during the campaign season of 189 BC. Rome's ally, the king of Pergamon Eumenes II, provided him with some auxiliary forces. Vulfso then embarked on his campaign, reaching the edge of the Telistobogais territory, which was inhabited by one of the three main Galatian tribes. Vulfso inspired his legionaries with a speech that said, "Of all the nations inhabiting Asia, the Gauls are preeminent for military fame," according to Livy, who again provides the closest thing we have to a modern account of events. Their great stature, long red hair, large shields, long swords, cries, dances, and the terrible crashing of their armor are all features that are designed to evoke fear. However, let such deeds shock the Phrygians, Carians, and Greeks, to whom these things seem foreign and odd. Even these futile attempts to incite fear are familiar to the Romans, who were used to Gallic upheavals. Our forefathers once ran away from them, but it was a long time ago. They first encountered them at the Allia. Since then, the Romans have slaughtered them like animals and driven them before them in horror. Before trying to win by the sword, Thulsa tried to gain victory via negotiation, despite his apparent disdain for the Anatolian Celts. He did this by sending envoys to the Galatian ruler Epipsognatus, who was sympathetic with Rome. Epipsognatus pledged to persuade the other three tribes' chieftains to accede to the Republic amicably. This gave Vulfso the confidence to march inland, where he gathered his force close to the Telisto-Bugi stronghold of Cobalum and waited for more information. Here he was met by mounted Galatian raiders rather than friendly emissaries. They attacked the Roman camp unexpectedly, causing minor fatalities before the Roman cavalry drove them away. The Romans found the city of Gordium, inhabited by Galatians, to be totally deserted when Vulfso broke camp and marched against it. The consul was informed by Epipsognathus's messengers of the obvious. Their commander had failed to persuade the Galatians to surrender to Roman rule. Additionally, they stated that the majority of the Telisto-Bogi and Trogmi, led by a single chief named Ortiagon, had fled to the Bithynian Olympus mountain, where more than 50,000 soldiers had taken up residence together with their wives and children. The Tectosagis, however, had taken a similar defensive stance and fled to Mount Magaba. The Talistavogye and Trogmi had set up camp at the top of the mountain, where they had constructed a trench and built defensive structures around their position. Volso's army found out when they arrived at the base of Athenian Olympus. They believed that by making the Romans ascend the mountain's treacherous and frigid slopes, they would wear down their enemy and make them easier to resist. After setting up camp 5 miles from the mountain, Volso gave his soldiers orders to assemble a variety of missile weapons, including as stones, javelins, arrows, and lead balls. After gathering his cavalry, the consul personally oversaw 2 reconnaissance trips up the mountains. During the expedition, a group of Gallic horsemen attacked them and forced them to retreat. After successfully reconnoitering the area, Volso found that there were 3 feasible routes for marching his army up the mountain, one on the southeast side of the mountain, where the terrain was earthy, and 2 more on the northwest side, all of which were extremely challenging. Volso divided his troops into 3 divisions and began his attack after performing the necessary sacrifices and divinations. The majority of his soldiers were personally led by the consul, who marched up where the mountain offered the simplest route. At the same time, he gave his brother Lucius Manlius and his servant Caius Helvius instructions to cautiously ascend the far more dangerous northwest and southeast hills. The Galatians dispatched an advance force of 4,000 men to garrison a hill overlooking the main route, assuming the Romans would simply move up the easy way. At this point, they came upon Volso's main force, and they entered the fight. The king of Pergamon's Cretan archers and slingers, along with the Roman velites, immediately launched a volley of missiles at the Gauls. The Gauls possessed minimal body armor, and their long shields, which were too thin for the width of their bodies, did little to defend them from the destructive effects of arrows, javelins, and lead balls. Further missile fire reduced the Gallic vanguard's ranks as they tried to rush down the Roman line, and upon collision, the velites' swords destroyed them. The Gauls were driven into a panic and withdrew back to their camp at the top of the mountain. At this point, Caius Helvius and Lucius Manlius had completed their grudges. Now, the 3 contingents surrounded the barrier of the Galatians and rained hellfire on it. The exposed and unarmored Gauls, along with their families, who were holed up in their camp with them, were pelted with javelins, arrows, rocks, and lead balls. As a fairly gory story, Livy tells us that the Romans knew their missiles were effectively destroying the Galatian soldiers only when they heard the screams and cries of their women and children. The Romans quite instantly overran the camp after Volso ordered it to be attacked once the enemy's numbers had been sufficiently reduced. Thousands of Gauls were killed or taken prisoner as they ran away from the stockade and down the slope in all directions. At total, 30,000 Galatians were captured and 10,000 were killed at the Battle of Mount Olympus. There were few Roman casualties. Volso marched toward Mount Magaba to grind the Tectosagus beneath his heel 3 days after he had crushed the Talistavogye and Trogmi. The consul was ambushed by a sizable number of the Tectosages cavalry as he was on his way to a diplomatic meeting, despite the fact that the envoys they dispatched had offered peace and surrender. With a group of Roman foragers fending off the Gallic cavalry, Volso barely escaped captivity. He then resolutely continued on to Mount Magaba, where he defeated the Tectosage host using the same strategies he had employed at Bithynian Olympus. Following this, Gnaeus Manlius Volso's victory gave Rome complete control, and the Gaulish territory in Asia was effectively placed under the Republic's overlordship. Though ostensibly autonomous, Anatolian Gauls were becoming more and more subject to Roman authority. The Romans exploited the Galatians as a buffer state to fight their Cappadocian and Pontic opponents through proxy warfare when the Republic annexed Pergamon in 133 BC. Pompey the Great fought the Pontic monarch Mithridates, and the Galatians were his devoted supporters during the Mithridatic Wars. Galatia was eventually conquered and become a province of the empire in 25 BC, following roughly 150 years of slow Romanization. Let's go back to northern Italy and rewind the clock back to the century BC. Rome's conquest of the Alps created an opportunity for its legions to advance into the Gallic area, which approximately corresponded to present-day France and was the center of the Celtic Latin world. The Greek city of Massalia, which had a complex and long-standing connection with the Celtic tribes who surrounding it served as the impetus for this. When the Gallic Saluvii tribe attempted to invade them in January, the Greeks turned on the Romans for assistance, since by that century, BC, they had also established a strong alliance and commercial relationship with the rising star that was Rome. 2 times in January 1954 and January 2025, the Republic assisted in defending Massalia against the Saluvii, glad of any pretext to deploy its soldiers over the Alps. Following the fight, the Romans generously promised to take over the hinterlands of Massalia in order to defend them from future Gallic invasions. The Greeks concurred, since trade was more important to them than maintaining territorial integrity. Teutomatulus, the vanquished Saluvii monarch, had fled north to the Allobroges realm, who were adjacent to the Arverni. This provided the ideal pretext for the Romans to launch an aggressive campaign of conquest into these 2 tribes' fertile territories. They attacked the Allobroges and Arverni's territories under the guise of pursuing Teutomatulus, and by January, they had taken over much of southern France. In contrast to Cisalpine Gaul, which was Gaul inside the Alps, they included it in their empire as the province of Transalpine Gaul, which meant Gaul outside the Alps. The border between the Celts and the Romans remained comparatively stable and even amicable for the greater part of a century following the creation of the province of Transalpine Gaul, which was eventually called Gallia Narbonensis. The Celtic Federation of Noricum, which had established a mutually beneficial alliance with Rome by the late century BC, is one example of this. Much of the steel required to outfit the Republic's legions came from the region's talented metallurgists, and the legions in turn offered the Republic military defense. The Romans were therefore ready to defend their Gallic allies when the Germanic Cimbri and Teutones tribes entered Noricum in 113 BC. Trading between Rome and other Celtic tribes had started to take off by the turn of the century BC, and a sophisticated system of treaties and trading networks existed between them. One may easily believe that trade between these two was one-sided, with the savage Gauls desiring the Romans' wealth. But this was not the case. Roman wine was very profitable to the Gauls, but Celtic products, such as their superb metalwork and other revolutionary Gallic discoveries, like soap and the wooden barrel, were also very beneficial to Rome. But in the 50s BC, when a certain Gaius Julius Caesar assumed power as governor of Cisalpine and Transalpine Gaul, the connection between the Latin and Celtic cultures would deteriorate once more, paving the way for what may be the most famous invasion expedition in Roman history. On paper, the mission was intended to stop hostile tribes from migrating into Roman territory, but it quickly turned into a full-scale conquest of the Gallic heartland, culminating in an enduring battle between the former triumvir and the courageous Arverni chieftain Vercingetorix. The most well-known conflict between the Celtic and Roman civilizations is also the one we will focus on the least in this video, because we have previously produced a 90-minute documentary that covers it in detail, which you can view in the description below. In any case, we are all aware of the conclusion. The freedom of the Gallic realm ended when Vercingetorix rode out of Alesia and threw his arms at the feet of the vanquished Roman consul. The Gallic world of continental Europe had virtually vanished by the year 50 BC. In the end, waves of migration by the Dacians, Ironic Sarmatian pastoralists, and early Germanic tribes displaced the Celtic regions of Eastern and Central Europe that had not been conquered by Rome. Naturally, the imperial eagle's wing now cast a shadow over the others. At a great blood cost, Celtic continental Europe had fallen under Roman rule by 50 BC, but their narrative did not finish there. The colonial Latin presence was still greatly outnumbered by the indigenous Celtic people, and the new Roman system appropriated their still operational infrastructure. When wattle and daub buildings were replaced with gridded streets, public baths, and gymnasiums, major Gallic hill fort sites such as Condatum, Lutetia, Lugdunum, Mediolanum, Serdica, and Ancira were transformed into Roman cities. Similar to the ancient hill forts, these towns continued to function as the center of power for a local Gallic tribe in spite of the new administration. At first, the Celts' lives did not significantly alter outside of the cities. Under Roman control, they lived in the same tribal settlements as their forefathers, speaking the same Celtic languages and growing the same crops. Most of them had been farmers in the countryside. It must not have mattered much to the Arvernian cooper or Armorican shepherd whether they gave a share of their labor to a ruler dressed in togas or a chieftain who wore speak. Thus, it would take generations for most Gallic people to become fully Latinized, because the Romans concentrated on ruling their subject peoples from the top down. This integration did happen comparatively more quickly among the higher classes. A significant Romanized material culture had already been formed by many Celtic chieftains through centuries of constant contact with Rome, and this process accelerated when many Gallic rulers sent their children to study under the Romans. As a suitable alternative to the proud Celtic warrior heritage, Gauls who had previously belonged to the aristocratic warrior caste enlisted in the legion as auxiliary, using the army as yet another means of assimilation. In addition to learning Latin, they offered sacrifices to the imperial worship temples found in each castra fort. Their integrated position in imperial society was solidified when they were granted full Roman citizenship upon their retirement. Celtic polytheism persisted far into the imperial age because subject peoples were free to worship whichever deities they choose, with the exception of the required adherents of the previously stated imperial cult, which honored the Roman emperors as celestial beings. Celts and Romans compared their gods to Taurus. The warlike tribal guardian was compared to Mars, while Tyrannus, the thunder deity, was compared to the Roman Jupiter. Some Celtic gods were even taken up by the Roman populace. For example, Epona, the goddess of horses, became the patroness of equestrians across the empire. But this cohabitation has its limitations. For instance, the Druids were frequently persecuted by the Romans. Emperor Tiberius was the first to repress them, and Emperor Claudius made it worse. Realistically, anti-Druidic laws were implemented because the Druids posed a danger to Roman authority, although they were typically implemented under the guise of abolishing ritual human sacrifice. In fact, the seeds of dissatisfaction sown from the shadows were blamed for a number of Gallic uprisings. However, theirs was a covert organization that was difficult to dismantle, and it is quite probable that the Druids concealed their teachings in secret woodland clearings and caves for years. Only a few Gallic aristocracy were allowed to enter the Roman Senate during Claudius's rule. This action was strongly opposed by many snobby senators who questioned how the emperor could let barbarians to sit among their esteemed ranks. Claudius replied sarcastically that they also were sprung from Italic tribes the Romans had subjugated and absorbed centuries before, the Umbrians, Sabines, and Samnites. In his mind, the Gauls were only the most recent of many peoples to be included into the ambitious imperial endeavor. A weird Levantine prophet, whom the Romans themselves had executed 2 centuries prior, was worshipped by followers of a new faith that had swept the empire in the century AD. As a persecuted underground sect, Christianity quickly expanded across the provinces before becoming the imperial state religion in a stunning change of events. By March, the pious Christian emperor Theodosius had completely outlawed all pagan activities when imperial attitudes toward ancient gods rapidly deteriorated. Whatever was left of traditional Celtic polytheism on the continent was most likely doomed by this. The world that the Gallo-Romans had endured for generations will vanish in the following century. Germanic peoples were Rome's main barbarian adversary, following the subjugation of the Celts. Along the Rhine and Danube rivers, many of their tribes had been trading, assimilating, or more frequently, fighting with Romans for ages. As peoples like the Visigoths, Ostrogoths, Vandals, and Franks exploited imperial decadence to invade Roman territory and establish kingdoms for themselves. The 400 CE were essentially the Germanic century, ending the western part of the empire. The direct descendants of chieftains and Druids, who had once referred to themselves as the warriors of the Senones Insubris, Boii, and Averni, were living among the Germanic conquerors of Europe as they established themselves in their recently captured territories. However, these individuals were irrevocably altered. In fact, Gaulish civilization had devolved into a mere echo by the time the Western Roman Empire fell, and the Celts of continental Europe had been subject to Latin dominion for more than 4 centuries. Its language had been gradually eroding in favor of the vulgar Latin dialects that would eventually become today's contemporary Romance languages, and its old cults had been supplanted by a monotheistic deity from the Levant. As late antiquity gave way to the Middle Ages, the Celtic identity had all but vanished, and a hybrid Germanic Latin custom would be the dominant culture upon which the majority of the kingdoms of early medieval Europe were built. However, it is possible that the Gaulish language persisted in a few remote mountain villages as late as the century AD. Once again, we appreciate War Thunder's sponsorship of this film. Play PvP on PCs or consoles for players of all skill levels, and don't forget to take advantage of our substantial free bonus pack that includes premium features. Get it all by clicking on the link in the description. Celtic culture in Europe did not disappear in the years following the collapse of Rome, because there was still one hazy island on the continent's edge where the local inhabitants continued to speak and identify as Celtic.